The year is 1964. In the humid heat of the White House, President Lyndon B. Johnson is staring at a map of Southeast Asia that is rapidly turning red. To the American public, the escalating conflict in Vietnam is pitched as a necessary crusade against communism, a dam holding back a red tide. But privately, inside the Oval Office, Johnson is grappling with a different kind of nightmare: isolation. He knows that if the United States marches into the jungle alone, it looks like an imperial invasion. It looks like colonialism. To sell this war to the American people and the world, Johnson doesn't just need soldiers, he needs flags. He needs the optics of a grand Western coalition standing shoulder to shoulder against tyranny. And there is only one flag that matters enough to validate the American intervention: the Union Jack. For 2 decades, the special relationship between Washington and London has been the bedrock of the Western Alliance, from the beaches of Normandy to the frozen reservoirs of the Korean War. Where America went, Britain followed. It was an unwritten rule of the Cold War, so, as the situation in Saigon deteriorates, Johnson turns his gaze across the Atlantic, fully expecting his oldest ally to fall in line. But in London, the mood is not one of martial solidarity. It is one of dread. Harold Wilson has just moved into 10 Downing Street. He is the first Labour Prime Minister in 13 years, ending a long era of Conservative rule. Wilson is a pragmatist, a man of statistics and smoke-filled rooms, and he finds himself immediately trapped in a geopolitical vice. He knows that his party base, the unions, the socialists, the students, view the war in Vietnam as a moral abomination. If he commits British troops to the jungle, his fragile government, holding on to power with a microscopic majority, will almost certainly collapse. Yet Wilson also knows that Britain is weak. The empire is dissolving, the economy is teetering on the edge of a precipice. The only thing keeping the British pound from collapsing is the goodwill and the financial backing of the United States Treasury. The tension comes to a head in late 1964 and early 1965 during the launch of what the White House calls the More Flags campaign. The State Department begins an aggressive diplomatic offensive, demanding that allies contribute forces to Vietnam. They pressure Australia. They pressure New Zealand. They pressure South Korea. But the prize remains Britain. The request from Washington is surprisingly specific, bordering on the theatrical. Johnson does not ask for an armoured division or a fleet of destroyers. He knows the British military is stretched thin. Instead, US Under-Secretary of State George Ball delivers a chillingly simple request to the British ambassador: send the Black Watch. The Black Watch. The legendary Scottish infantry regiment with a history dating back to the 1700s. The Americans argue that they don't even need the regiment to fight. They just need the pomp and circumstance. They need the bagpipes playing in Saigon. They need the image of the kilts and the Queen's soldiers marching alongside US Marines. It is a request for a symbolic blood sacrifice, a token force to prove to the world that the civilized nations are united. Johnson assumes Wilson will cave. The pressure is immense. The phone calls from the White House become increasingly belligerent. Johnson, a man famous for his physical intimidation tactics, begins to view Wilson's hesitation not as a difference of policy, but as a personal betrayal. He is asking for a bagpipe band. Wilson is giving him silence. As 1965 dawns, and the US prepares to deploy its first major combat units, the special relationship hits its lowest point in the 20th century. Wilson is trying to walk a tightrope over a canyon. On one side, the anger of the American president, a man who holds the fate of the British economy in his hands. On the other, the fury of the British public and his own cabinet. Wilson makes his choice. He refuses the Black Watch. He refuses the flags. But he knows that saying no to Lyndon Johnson comes with a price tag. And as the British economy begins to bleed, Johnson prepares to collect the debt. The rejection of the More Flags campaign isn't just a diplomatic spat. It is the opening move in a high-stakes game of economic blackmail that will threaten the very survival of the British currency. To understand why Harold Wilson could not simply send a battalion to Vietnam and be done with it, one must look away from the jungles of Southeast Asia and toward the trading floors of the City of London. In the mid-1960s, Britain is not a superpower in hibernation. It is an empire on life support. The country is widely derided as the sick man of Europe. Its industry is outdated, its productivity is stagnant, and its debts from the Second World War are still suffocating the treasury. But the true Achilles heel of the British state is the pound sterling. For decades, the pound has been pegged at $2.80. It is a symbol of British pride and stability. But the markets know the truth. The price is a fantasy. International speculators, the so-called gnomes of Zurich, smell blood. They begin selling off sterling in massive quantities, betting that Britain will run out of cash and be forced to devalue. A run on the pound is underway. If the currency crashes, the cost of imports will skyrocket. Inflation will destroy the savings of the working class, and Wilson's government will almost certainly fall. Wilson needs a shield. He needs a massive injection of capital to buy up sterling and artificially prop up its value. There is only one bank in the world with pockets deep enough to save him: the United States Federal Reserve. This economic desperation creates a terrifying dynamic for the British Prime Minister. He is effectively begging his banker for a loan, while simultaneously refusing his banker's requests to join a fight. In Washington, the connection between the two issues is made brutally clear. The Johnson administration views the pound and the Vietnam War as two sides of the same coin. Senior American officials, including National Security Advisor McGeorge Bundy, begin to draft memos that explicitly link the safety of the sterling to British participation in Vietnam. The logic is transactional and cold. If Britain wants American dollars to save its economy, Britain must spend British blood to save American face in Vietnam. This is the hidden war of 1965. While American Marines are landing at Da Nang, Harold Wilson is fighting for his political life in meeting rooms in Washington and London. The pressure is relentless. During late-night phone calls, Johnson reminds Wilson of the burden America carries. He implies that if Britain cannot act like a world power by projecting military force alongside the US, then perhaps it does not deserve the financial support reserved for a world power. The threat hanging in the air is the Hessian option. In the 18th century, British kings hired German Hessian mercenaries to fight their wars. Now, the roles are reversed. The United States is the wealthy empire, and it is looking to hire British soldiers to bolster its ranks. However, Wilson identifies a flaw in Johnson's blackmail. He realizes that the special relationship is a trap for the Americans too. The global financial system is interconnected. If the pound sterling collapses, the shockwaves could destabilize the US dollar and wreck the Western economy. Johnson can threaten to pull the plug, but he knows that if the British economy sinks, it might drag the American economy down with it. Wilson gambles everything on this single insight. He bets that Johnson is bluffing. He accepts the financial aid, billions of dollars in short-term credit and loans, while stubbornly keeping the Black Watch in their barracks. He essentially takes the money and runs, offering LBJ nothing but warm words and diplomatic support. It is a masterclass in political survival, a high-wire act where Wilson plays the weak hand so effectively that the strong hand cannot crush him. But money is not the only leverage Johnson possesses. As the economic blackmail fails to produce soldiers, the White House pivots to strategy. If Britain won't fight for money, perhaps they can be shamed into fighting for strategic necessity. The Americans look at the map and see that Britain is already fighting a war of its own in the jungle. A war that Johnson decides is the perfect excuse to drag them into his. While the cameras of the world are fixed on the rice paddies of the Mekong Delta, a second shadow war is raging just a few hundred miles to the south. Deep in the dense, suffocating rainforests of Borneo, British special forces are engaged in a vicious conflict that history has largely forgotten. The Konfrontasi. It is an undeclared war between the newly formed Federation of Malaysia, supported by Britain, and the aggressive regime of Indonesia, led by President Sukarno. Sukarno, flirting with communism and backed by the Soviet Union, is determined to crush the new Malaysian state. For Britain, this is not a colonial skirmish. It is a treaty obligation to defend a Commonwealth ally. By 1965, the British military is stretched to its absolute breaking point. Over 50,000 British troops, along with Gurkhas, Australians and New Zealanders, are deployed across the archipelago. They are fighting a masterclass in counterinsurgency. Unlike the Americans in Vietnam, who are relying on massive firepower, body counts and napalm, the British in Borneo are fighting with silence and precision. Small patrols of SAS soldiers live in the jungle for weeks, winning the hearts and minds of the local tribes, and conducting claret operations, secret cross-border raids into Indonesian territory that are officially denied by London. For Harold Wilson, the Konfrontasi is a terrifying drain on resources, but in his duel with Lyndon Johnson, it becomes his greatest weapon. When Johnson demands the Black Watch for Vietnam, Wilson pulls out the map of Borneo. He crafts a brilliant strategic defence. Britain is fighting the spread of communism, he argues. They are holding the line in Indonesia. He tells the president that the British military is fully committed. If he were to pull troops out of Borneo to send them to Vietnam, the domino of Indonesia, a nation of over 100 million people, would fall to the communists. It is an argument that Johnson cannot easily dismantle. The US State Department is terrified of Indonesia turning red. They know that the British presence in Borneo is the only thing preventing a total collapse of Western influence in the region. Wilson effectively tells Johnson, "We are guarding the back door while you guard the front. Do you want us to abandon our post?" This allows Wilson to reframe his refusal. He isn't saying no because he is a coward or a socialist sympathizer. He is saying no because he is a responsible military strategist. He positions Britain not as a reluctant ally, but as an equal partner shouldering its own burden in the global fight against tyranny. But beneath this strategic logic lies a deeper, unspoken truth. The British military leadership looks at Vietnam with a growing sense of horror. They have spent decades fighting jungle insurgencies in Malaya and now Borneo. They know how these wars are won, through patience, intelligence, and political isolation of the enemy. When they look at the American strategy of search and destroy, massive bombing campaigns, and the deployment of hundreds of thousands of conscripts, they see a catastrophe in the making. Field Marshal Sir Gerald Templer, the architect of Britain's victory in the Malayan emergency, privately warns that the American approach is doomed. The British refusal to join is not just about politics or economics, it is about professional military judgment. They do not want to attach their flag to a sinking ship. However, Wilson knows he cannot simply hide behind the excuse of Borneo forever. Johnson's patience is eroding, and the American military machine is hungry for expertise. If Britain won't provide the soldiers, they must provide the brains. And so, a secret channel is opened. While the British public is told that their government is keeping them out of the war, British intelligence and military advisors quietly begin to pack their bags for Saigon. While Harold Wilson stands at the dispatch box in Parliament, assuring the British people that no British troops will set foot in Vietnam, the machinery of the British state is quietly gearing up to assist the American war effort. Wilson has drawn a very specific red line. He will not send combat battalions. He will not send the flag. But everything else, intelligence, logistics, training and doctrine, is on the table. The most visible, yet carefully camouflaged contribution is the British Advisory Mission, or BRIAM. Leading this effort is Sir Robert Thompson, a legend in the world of irregular warfare. Thompson is the man who helped crush the communist insurgency in Malaya. He arrives in Saigon not as a combatant, but as a consultant. His mission is to teach the American military giants how to fight a small war. He meets with US generals, preaching the gospel of patience, police work, and winning the hearts and minds of the peasantry. He argues that firepower is useless if the political structure is rotten. The Americans listen, but they do not hear. To the Pentagon, Thompson's methods seem quaint, too slow for the industrial war they intend to wage. Yet his presence allows Wilson to tell Johnson, "We have given you our best mind." But the support goes deeper than advice. Deep in the jungles of Johor, in what is now Malaysia, the British Jungle Warfare School becomes a quiet hub for American preparation. Here, British instructors, fresh from the firefights of Borneo, train American special forces and officers. They teach them how to track, how to survive, and how to ambush in the dense canopy. It is a direct transfer of lethal skills, hidden away from the prying eyes of the British press. Then there is the unsinkable aircraft carrier, Hong Kong. As a British colony, Hong Kong sits on the doorstep of the conflict. Officially, Britain is neutral, but practically, the harbour of Hong Kong becomes a vital lung for the US Navy. American warships dock for repairs and resupply. Thousands of American Gs flood the city for rest and recreation, pouring millions of dollars into the local economy. Intelligence flows from the colony too. The listening stations of GCHQ in Hong Kong intercept North Vietnamese communications, feeding raw data directly to the NSA. If Wilson truly wanted to hinder the war, he could have closed the port. He never considers it. The neutrality stops at the water's edge. Even more controversial are the whispers of direct involvement. Reports, long denied but persistent, suggest that members of the SAS and other special units operate in Vietnam under the guise of observers or are sheep-dipped, temporarily resigned from the British Army to serve as contractors for Australian or New Zealand units. They are ghosts in the machine, allowing Britain to gain combat experience against Soviet weaponry without ever officially being at war. Wilson has constructed an elaborate fiction. To the world, Britain is the wise, abstaining friend. To the White House, Britain is the silent partner, providing the software of war, intelligence and training, while refusing to provide the hardware. It is a compromise that saves British lives, but it destroys the personal relationship between the two leaders. Johnson accepts the help, but he despises the secrecy. He views Wilson as a hypocrite, a man happy to take American money and use American protection, but too cowardly to share the American burden. The friction is building toward a breaking point. Johnson is becoming increasingly erratic, consumed by the failure of the war. Wilson, sensing an opportunity to play the statesman, decides to launch a grand diplomatic initiative to end the conflict. He believes he can be the broker between Washington and Moscow, but in doing so, he will walk straight into a trap, leading to one of the most humiliating moments in British diplomatic history. A moment where the President of the United States will finally unleash his full fury on the Prime Minister. The final act of this diplomatic tragedy plays out in February 1967. The setting is London, during a high-stakes visit by Alexei Kosygin, the Soviet premier. The Vietnam War has ground into a bloody stalemate, and Harold Wilson sees his moment. If he can use his relationship with the Soviets to broker a peace deal between Hanoi and Washington, he will not only end the war, but cement Britain's status as a global power broker, independent of American orders.
The operation is codenamed Sunflower. For a week, Wilson shuttles frantically between Downing Street and Claridge's Hotel, where Kosygin is staying. The atmosphere is electric. Wilson believes he is on the verge of a breakthrough. He has a direct line to the White House. He extracts what he believes are clear terms from the Americans. If North Vietnam stops infiltration, the US will stop the bombing. Wilson presents this to Kosygin. The Soviets seem interested. The machinery of peace begins to turn. But across the Atlantic, the mood is cynical. The White House views Wilson's freelancing with deep suspicion. While Wilson is negotiating in good faith, the hawks in Washington, fearing a trap by the communists, suddenly harden their terms. In the middle of the night, while Wilson is finalizing the proposal with Kosygin, a telegram arrives from Washington. The terms have changed. The goalposts have been moved. Wilson is left humiliated. He has presented a deal to the Soviet premier that the Americans have just revoked. He looks like a puppet who has had his strings cut. The peace initiative collapses, and Kosygin leaves London empty-handed. Wilson is furious, convinced he has been sabotaged by his own allies. The fallout is toxic. When Wilson attempts to explain his position to Johnson later, the president explodes. The veneer of diplomatic politeness is ripped away. Johnson, exhausted and bitter, reportedly unleashes a tirade that defines the era. He views Wilson's attempts at peace not as help, but as interference. The sentiment is crude and brutal. If you aren't fighting with us, you don't get to tell us how to end the fight. Months later, the final domino of the deal falls. In November 1967, the British economy can no longer hold back the tide. Despite all the American loans, despite all the political contortions, the markets win. Wilson is forced to devalue the pound sterling. The very thing he had traded his dignity to prevent happens anyway. But in this failure, there is a strange kind of victory. The devaluation breaks the leverage Washington held over London. With the pound effectively crashed, Johnson can no longer threaten the British economy. The chains are off. Wilson formally announces the withdrawal of British forces from east of Suez. The empire is officially closing down. Britain is retreating to Europe, leaving the United States to face the Vietnam quagmire alone. In the years that follow, the wisdom of Wilson's stubborn refusal becomes painfully clear. As the US body count rises to 58,000 and the war tears American society apart, Britain remains at peace. There are no British names on a Vietnam memorial wall. There were no riots in Trafalgar Square comparable to those in Chicago. The Labour government, though battered by economic failure, avoided the moral and military catastrophe that destroyed the Johnson presidency. The special relationship enters a deep freeze. The warmth of the World War II era is replaced by a cool, transactional distance that will last until the arrival of Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan. But Harold Wilson, the man often mocked for his duplicity and his grey pragmatism, achieved the one thing that mattered most. Facing down the most powerful man on earth, he held the line. He paid for Britain's safety with his own reputation, proving that sometimes the most courageous act of leadership is simply the ability to say no. History often remembers the wars that were fought, but it rarely celebrates the wars that were avoided. Harold Wilson's refusal to enter Vietnam is perhaps the single most significant British strategic decision of the Cold War. A moment where the UK stepped out of America's shadow and refused to jump off the cliff. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the secret history of the special relationship,
make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. We've got more documentaries coming on the hidden geopolitics of the 20th century. And let us know in the comments, do you think Wilson was right to abandon the US, or should allies always fight together? Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.